This is one of my favorite things to talk about. If I've definitely cornered people occasionally at the local bar and probably given this whole presentation several times there before I ever put it on a PowerPoint. So all right, I'm going to share my screen and let's make sure that
looks great.
So you're seeing my Auto Lite Strike page, right?
Yes.
Okay. My give me 1 second. My oh, okay. Well, we'll work with my display. Just was a little weird, but we'll work with it. All right. So our topic tonight is the Auto Lite Strike of 1934 and how Toledo became a Union town. As Heather said, I live in Toledo. I'm a transplant here. I've lived here since 2006. And I was aware of the Auto Lite Strike prior to moving here. I've always had a passion for local history, no matter where I live. And as Heather said, I was a longtime labor organizer. So this was one of the things I really was really interested in learning more about when I moved here. And I had initially read about it in the context of the Minneapolis 1934 strike. So we'll do a little bit of table setting at the beginning, but 1934 was a big year for the labor movement in that there were effectively general strikes in San Francisco, Minneapolis, and Toledo of that year. And while they weren't necessarily explicitly called as general strikes, I say effectively because they effectively shut down the cities entirely. In Minneapolis, the strike was a trucker strike that shut down basically shut down all transportation in the city. And I actually don't know the details of San Francisco very well. But in Toledo, it started at an auto parts plant, and we all know from being in northern Ohio, auto parts and auto assembly is a big deal here. So the beginning here, that right, I did want to start with our Ohio historical marker, and this is from a park in Toledo that's the site of the Auto Lite plant. It was torn down in the 60s, I believe. But the land was never redeveloped, and sometime back in the 90s, the Central Labor Council, along with some other folks in town, got together to make it into a park. They reconstructed some of the factory entrances. If you look, all the bricks they used in the park were bricks from the old factory after they tore it down. And it's known as Union Memorial Park. So it's dedicated to the Auto Lite Strike, but also includes a monument to workers who died on the job throughout the years. So it's a pretty cool little space that honestly a lot of people in Toledo don't really know about because it's a little bit out of the way. So 1934 is in many ways, right, we're looking at the low point, or I guess 33 into 34, we're looking at the low point of the Great Depression. Right, there's massive unemployment. Right, people are losing their homes, people are going hungry, they're out of work. We see here, this is a picture. Actually, I don't know where this picture's from. It's not Toledo, I don't believe, but these were common sights, right? I mean, we hear people talk about bread lines, and here you just have people lined up for free soup, free coffee, free donuts, because folks were hard up. So if we look, we can see our famous 1929 stock market crash here, as far as what it meant for the total economy. And in the course of from October in 1929 all the way through the early part of 1933 is this steady decline. I mean, there's some fits and starts, but we see just a massive contraction of the economy. And along that, we see this, incredible decrease in jobs, Around the unemployment rate starting in 1929 goes from less than 5%, about 3% there, all the way up to 25%. And much like today, the unemployment rate is based on people who are active, who are willing and able and actively looking for work. So this 25%, is certainly an underestimate. By 1933, we reach our highest point, but it was definitely way more than 25% in terms of people who wanted to work and needed to work, but had just sort of given up looking because the work wasn't there. This picture is along the banks of the Maumee River here in Toledo. If you've been just north of present day downtown, if you've been to downtown Toledo, but these are basically tar paper shacks. So people had just had thrown them up along the banks of the river. If you've been here, I don't know what time of year this picture was taken, but there's a good chance in the spring, in every March and April, that this probably floods significantly. But it shows a sign of the level of desperation for a lot of people. So in 1933, FDR takes office as the newly elected president. And today we tend to think of FDR as, we associate him with the New Deal and all of these massive recovery programs. But at the beginning of his presidency, FDR had promised only very minor and small reforms, and had actually run for office on a platform of cutting the federal spending budget. So he had started some of the most popular programs of the New Deal early on in his presidency in 1933, including the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority projects, but he had also cut the federal budget. And he did that by reducing federal employee salaries, and he attempted to remove large numbers of people from military pensions. And the only thing that stopped him was that Congress passed a law preventing him from doing it and overrode his veto. So there were limited amounts of work programs that the federal government had rolled out, but the pay tended to be quite low. The conditions not necessarily good. There was a significant amount of union organizing that took place in those sectors because of the conditions. More broadly, unemployed workers around the country started organizing as unemployed leagues or unemployed councils or unemployed unions. A number of different structures popped up. This the Unemployed Citizens League was primarily on the West Coast, and different organizations stood behind him. There were unemployed councils that were primarily backed by the Communist Party USA. There were the Unemployed Leagues, which were the dominant form of organization in Ohio, were backed by the American Workers' Party and several trade unions. And the American Workers' Party was led by this guy here, A.J. Muste, and he's I think, underappreciated figure in the history of of the left in American protest, but he went on to actually play a leading role in starting the movement against the war in Vietnam much later in life. This picture is from closer to then. But he had been involved in labor organizing and socialist organizing back as early as the Lowell, Massachusetts textile strike. Around in the early 1930s, Musty, along with others, founded the American Workers' Party, which was an explicitly revolutionary socialist party, but also explicitly anti-Stalinist. So they didn't identify necessarily as being a Trotskyist party like most anti-Stalinist parties at the time did, but they did explicitly reject Stalin, but did support revolutionary socialism. And the American Workers' Party helped establish these unemployed councils or unemployed leagues around the country. And in Toledo, that was the Lucas County Unemployed League, which had been active for several years by 1934, and had primarily organized around relief programs in the city. And my favorite unemployed league story is that the mayor of Toledo had cut food benefit programs in the city. So there had been direct financial and direct food aid available to the city, and the mayor cut the spending towards that. So the Unemployed League, their members would, they had friends inside the city building, and so whenever they learned that the mayor was going out to dinner or lunch or breakfast, that they would take a large group of people from the Unemployed League would go in, all sit down to order, and they would order their meals, and because because food was scarce, people were really hungry, and so sometimes they'd order 2 and 3 meals for them and eat and finish all of them while they were there. And then when the bill came due, they would just tell the restaurant owner that the mayor was paying this one. It actually did end up result in the mayor reinstituting the food assistance. That mayor, as you can imagine, was not particularly popular among anyone at that point. The unemployed people and workers didn't like him because he cut aid. And when he caved and restored it, the bosses didn't think much of him either. This is a slight side note, but it is helpful in informing the story. He was defeated by a man named Solon Klotz, which I am probably mispronouncing, whose name pops up a lot in the history of Toledo politics. He had been a member of the Socialist Party USA way back when. He actually was, and he was an attorney who actually represented people who were arrested for trying to host a public speaking event with Eugene Debs. By the time he was elected in 1933, he took office at the beginning of 1934. The Socialist Party USA wasn't much of a going entity here anymore. It's not clear how much he still identified as a socialist, but he definitely came out of that tradition, and his actions or his deliberate inactions end up playing a extremely helpful role to the strikers. So in February of 1934, the workers at Auto Lite, and that would manufactured spark plugs, if I failed to mention it, they were members of Federal Labor Union 18384. And they went on strike for recognition. And they demanded recognition, a wage increase, and a contract. For a little bit of background, federal labor unions at the time were chartered directly through the central labor councils. And they tended to be multi-employer and sometimes even multi-craft unions. And they were almost like the union for people who didn't have a union to join, whereas the carpenters would have joined the carpenters and the Teamsters, drivers would have joined the Teamsters, but these federal labor unions were for anybody else. And in 1933, the year before, the Labor Council had launched a citywide organizing drive. It was a fairly ambitious plan. They selected a couple of workplaces where they had built committees, and those workplaces went on strike for recognition. A group of workers at Auto Lite had formed a committee and wanted to join, but the Labor Council recommended that they not, because they felt that they weren't strong enough to do it yet. But workers in one department in 1933 went against the wishes of the Labor Council and went on strike anyways. Being that it was just a single department, they didn't have a lot of power, they didn't have a lot of leverage, and Auto Lite's response was to fire them within a few days. They continued picketing, but they changed their demand, and instead of demanding union recognition, they just demanded to be rehired. And eventually the company agreed to bring them back. They were skilled workers, they were hard to replace, and the picketing out front was just a headache for the company, and it wasn't a big deal. It was 10 or 12 workers, so they brought them back. But once they came back, they started they got to the hard work of organizing the rest of their workplace. So by February 1934, almost 100% of the workers walk out and demand a contract. On March 1st, Auto Lite agreed to a 5% wage increase to negotiate a union contract and recognize the union. And they'd had the contract done by April 1st. But that didn't happen. And on April 12th, Auto Lite was still refusing to agree to a contract. So the union votes to go on strike a second time. This time, the strike didn't quite have 100% support. It was not as solid as the strike in February, but it was enough to shut the plant down, to the point that initially the company didn't make any attempt to stop, or didn't make an attempt to continue production. The Lucas County Unemployed League, which, as I mentioned before, was led by the American Workers' Party, joined the picketing almost immediately. And this was really remarkable because typically, workers would use unemployed workers as strikebreakers. But instead of acting as strikebreakers or just staying out of it altogether, massive numbers of unemployed workers end up on the side of the striking workers and join the pickets. And the pickets grow to be fairly large, not massive by any means. But they were big enough that the company ended up asking for an injunction. So Judge Roy Stewart, who as much as anybody is the bad guy in this story, although he redeems himself a tiny little bit at the end, but we're certainly no friend of working people, issues an injunction that limits picketing to 25 pickets per entrance. And so far, this is fairly routine. That's not even a super restrictive injunction. I've been subject to worse. But what's remarkable is that the Lucas County Unemployed League responds to the judge. And so the judge issues his injunction on May 3rd. On May 5th, the Lucas County Unemployed League responds. And they write this absolutely fantastic letter in which they openly say, we are not going to follow your injunction. We are going to disregard it. We are going to join the picket lines. And basically said, do your best. The one thing that's in common with the Lucas County Unemployed League and the union that was the main force in the Minneapolis Teamster strike is they both talked about how they would paper the walls with injunctions. The judges would write injunctions and they would just hang them up on the walls, and you know, it was almost a joke. I see we have some. I just wanted to check the chat real quick. So right, and they say, we sincerely believe that this court intervention preventing us from picketing is an abrogation of our democratic rights, contrary to our constitutional liberties, and contravenes the spirit and the letter of Section 7A of the NRA. Therefore, with full knowledge of the principles involved and the possible consequences, we openly and publicly violate an injunction, which in our opinion is suppressive and oppressive act against all workers. And yeah, and then the secretary had to put his name to it. But right, this is remarkable. So initially, they begin to violate the injunction. And it starts slowly. The first day after this letter was then put out, the next day, they had pickets of about 40 people at the main entrance. So they were in violation, but it was still a fairly small picket. Up to this point in the strike, the police department has been remarkably quiet and absent. And interestingly, the Toledo Police Department continues to be, because Mayor Klotz, the one time possibly still socialist, just told them to leave the strikers alone. and remarkably they did. But we know that when the power of capital is threatened, they will find people to do their work. So they brought in the Lucas County Sheriff's deputies to handle what the Toledo City Police wouldn't. So the sheriff's deputies start arresting people. There are, for a fair bit of time, there are daily arrests, and they almost build a routine. Workers are arrested. You know, they get taken to the courthouse for their arraignments. Hundreds of picketers show up and crowd the courtroom, and they chant and they sing and they shout down the judges, and they have a great time with it. To the point that even the Toledo News B, which is now defunct but was one of the daily newspapers at the time, right, their caption is, "Here's a happy group of striking former employees taken while they were arrested." So this became, right away, it was a badge of honor, right? You got arrested, you went to the courthouse, you raised hell, and they let you go, and until you went back to the picket line the next day and you did it all over again. But then they got word that Auto Lite intended to bring strikebreakers in. And that spurred the picket lines to get bigger. So now, instead of 40 or 60 or 100 picketers, the day that they expected strikebreakers to come in, now there are over 1,000 people picketing in front of the plant. And then they got even bigger when the sheriffs, trying to make some arrests and cut down the picket lines, end up beating an elderly man that was in the picket. So we have a picture of the size of this picket. This is what the front of the plant is starting to look like. And sheriff's deputies beat this man on the picket line, which spurred more people. They also ended up trying to escort striking workers in, and as the workers tried to fight off the deputies and the company security guards, the sheriffs end up retreating with the strikebreakers, and the company men ended up retreating into the factory where they had stockpiled tear gas and vomit gas, and fought a 7-hour battle with the strikers and the picketers. And this is, I wasn't able to pinpoint exactly what day this picture was from, but I believe it is from the early morning after this battle. It happened mostly at night. And to the point that the striking workers attempted to storm the plant on several occasions, almost breaking through, and they never quite could. The sheriff's deputies were able to hold them off. But as you can imagine, right, this leads the picket lines again to be bigger. So we end up with picket lines on, sorry, date here. Went too far. We end up with picket lines of about 10,000 people show up at the largest.
So are these people from Toledo, or are they like coming in from all over at this point?
As far as I've been able to tell, almost all of them are from Toledo. There are some people who've come from out of town, several leaders from the Workers' Party, and likely several leaders from other political groupings. But the crowd was largely made up of people in Toledo, and was largely driven, the turnout was largely done by the Unemployed Council. There was, at this point, there was limited participation from other trade unions, but there was definitely some presence. So yeah, I mean, if you think about this at the time, this is a significant portion of the population of the city, which is why I think it qualifies as effectively a general strike. So after this battle, the governor calls in the National Guard to try to break the strike. And they call the National Guard in from Fremont. The governor, right, and the company have both thought about this enough and knew that bringing in the local detachment probably wouldn't help, because when you have 10,000 people on the picket line, everyone in the National Guard unit is going to know or be related to people, and we know that makes them reluctant to use force. So they called in the unit from Fremont. This was towards the end of May. Large quantities of the Guard members in Fremont were high school students who were scheduled to attend their graduation that weekend. And instead of going to their high school graduation, they got to come to Toledo to try to break up a strike. As the workers had done to the sheriff's deputies, they were having none of it. So they stood their ground and they fought the National Guard, to the point that the battle left the grounds of the plant and ended up stretching throughout the large parts of the north side of the city. And you have National Guard detachments moving through neighborhoods, and tear gas and vomit gas being, that was drifting from the plant into neighborhoods and even being used in the neighborhoods. And this is, you can tell it's a little hard to see through the haze, but these are just people's houses, and this is the scene with tear gas and rocks. You can see all the rocks that are being hurled at the Guard, and the Guard fully armed, going through the neighborhood, and you can just barely make out some of the picketers across the intersection there. And so this battle goes on for several days before eventually it calms down, and a sort of agreed upon peace, comes to the situation, that it's effectively both sides realized that they had fought to a stalemate, and the Guard knew they weren't going to win, but the strikers also understood they weren't going to win this battle against the National Guard. So things tended to settle down, but you can imagine we're still quite tense over the next several days in the city. And I especially like this picture because it's right. If you look at this after the series of others, that it's a little bit of calm, but you also wonder how many days do you see all these people out right in their neighborhood in Toledo, standing on the street. And here's just another shot of after, and this is after things had settled down, but the National Guard maintained a presence. And again, you can see these are people's houses that the Guard is just set up a blockade at someone's house. So meanwhile, as this massive street battle is going on and calming down, right, obviously Auto Lite was not able to reopen the facility, so they're still not able to produce. The Central Labor Union had been discussing for about a month at this point the idea of a general strike to support the Auto Lite workers. And this was the spur that pushed them forward. So almost all of the unions in the city of Toledo issued Auto Lite a deadline and said that if they did not meet if they did not have a settled contract by that date, that every union worker in the city of Toledo would go on strike. And this obviously, brings in other employers. People reached out. At one point, actually reached directly to FDR personally and asked him to personally intervene in the strike. He did not intervene personally, but he sent the grandson of William Howard Taft of the prominent Ohio political family in to serve as a mediator. In the meantime, a bunch of people in the city who were not too happy about all this tear gas and vomit gas in their neighborhood started filing criminal complaints against Clement Minger, who was the CEO of Auto Lite. And they were strong enough complaints and were supported enough that Judge Roy Stewart, our bad guy from the beginning who issued the injunction, actually ends up issuing a warrant for the arrest of Clement Minger. And the Toledo police were more than happy to serve that warrant. So we have, towards the end of the strike, we have the CEO, right, the CEO is in jail awaiting a trial. The entire labor movement in the city is threatening to go on strike. And right, the grandson of a president has stepped in to try to mediate. So, and the National Guard's still in the streets. So in light of all this, the Auto Lite management and Federal Labor Union 18384 are able to come to an agreement for a contract. It included a 5% raise, which was part of Auto Lite's commitment originally that they had not lived up to. Union recognition. It also meant that the company explicitly did not recognize a small company union they were trying to organize in place of the Federal Labor Union. They want a contract with grievance and arbitration procedures, and probably most importantly, they want preferential rehiring for any workers who had been on strike and were fired or laid off. So it made sure that anyone who was on strike were the first ones back to work as production got going again. Interestingly, the American Workers' Party leadership had recommended that the workers reject this contract. They believed that they could have fought for more. But the workers ended up deciding it. And from the firsthand accounts I've been able to dig into, it's most likely just because they were exhausted, right? I mean, they just fought, like a 3-day mini war with the National Guard. People were tired, and so and this was a huge victory. The significance of this whole thing would be significant if that were the end of the story, right? Because we have unemployed workers playing a dominant role in winning a strike, and as opposed to acting as strike breakers. We have, to my knowledge, the only time that striking workers and their supporters have fought the National Guard to a stalemate. Every other time we hear about the National Guard getting called on a strike, either involves the National Guard just massacring people or beating people, or it just being the end of the fight because people didn't know how or weren't capable of fighting back. So this is all remarkable if that's all that happened. But the historical significance of this is even bigger. So Federal Labor Union 18384, thankfully for our being able to remember the name of the union, went on to become a founding member of the United Auto Workers several years later, along with workers from the plant in Flint, Michigan, where they pioneered the sit-down strike, from other auto plants around Michigan and Northern Ohio and Indiana. And Local 12 went on to play a major role in organizing Chrysler. This was the major project that they followed up the success of the strike. And in 1935, they launched an organizing drive at the Chrysler assembly plant that was here at the time, which I believe was the first Chrysler plant to be organized. That local is still around as Local 14. And Local 12 is still a massively important institution in Toledo. They still represent workers at Jeep. Auto Lite, of course, is long gone, but they represent workers at Jeep and at several parts manufacturers. They represent healthcare workers. In fact, a lot of Local 12 members that work at a hospital were on strike 2 years ago in what was a pretty significant local action. The Central Labor Council is based inside of Local 12. It's an organizing center for many other unions and many community groups. If there is a big labor event that happens in Toledo, it probably happens at Local 12. And if you've ever come to volunteer on political campaigns in Toledo, you have probably gone to Local 12 to meet up and start the day's canvassing or handbilling or whatever was in store. So that is the story of the Auto Lite Strike. I am happy to take questions if we want to pose any discussion questions for folks. I will hand the reins back over to our hosts.